This begins part two of History 1301, the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783. Part one kind of ended abruptly. Sorry about that. I wasn't paying attention to my business, but here we go with the second half. We've talked about Lexington Concord. We've talked about population. We're going to continue to talk about politics, money. We're taking a look at a selection of the battles. Again, we can't cover them all. So we're covering the ones that are really, really consequential. Ended with the Treaty of, I'm sorry, with the Battle of Saratoga, 1777, and that brought the French in on the American side. That led to a series of treaties and a tremendous enhancement of the American effort against Great Britain here. So we're going to continue on with a survey of battles. We'll talk about the efforts of George Rogers Clark. We'll take a look at the effort at sea. That's going to be very complex. Be prepared to take a lot of good notes on that. Then we'll talk about politics. That's going to be the Arts Confederation government. And then we'll get to the last operation of the war, which is the Yorktown Campaign. And that will then lead to the Treaty of Paris, 1783, and that'll tie up the war. So a strong 11 slides here, a lot of things that you guys need to take strong notes on. And again, let's get on with it. This slide, all I want you to know is, once again, a reminder: read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I covered both of those pretty clearly on the previous presentation, so make sure that that part gets done. So with that in mind, let's get cracking on part two, American War of Independence. Okay, so what we're looking at here is phase two of the war. We're in phase two of the war. For the phase of the war, go to the first part of the presentation, part one, and I talked about there very thoroughly. The war is divided up into three phases: the northern phase, the middle or peripheral phase, and the southern phase. So here we are in phase two of the war. Strong note here, don't get lost. Phase two of the war is divided up into two parts: the war at land and the war at sea. So middle phase of the war, phase two of the war, and we're talking now about the war on land. Now, again, there's lots and lots of battles that we talk about. The war on land, I don't know, the fighting in and around Philadelphia, the fighting around Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine Creek. There's one battle after another, after another, after another. But in my view, and the view of many other historians, that just leads to the next battle. So rather, let's talk about something that has really, really tremendous consequences over a long period of time, and that is the efforts of George Rogers Clark. If you'll check your textbook, you'll see that all this is in your textbook as well. This is not very strongly covered, but pretty strongly covered. So let's start then with George Rogers Clark. Now, just a slight bio on George Rogers Clark. His father was named Robert Rogers of Rogers Rangers, and he was really influential in the 7 Years' War. He'd done a lot of commando work. He'd perfected Indian fighting, as it was called then. Recruited a lot of guys and acted a lot against Native Americans in the 7 Years' War and against the French. And he was very, very consequential in that, a very influential individual. Well, this is his son, George Rogers Clark. He took the last name Clark as an homage to a close personal friend of his. And then he's going to have a son, William Clark, of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so as a family, they're very, very influential, and they will be involved in the Army right the way to the present day, as it turns out. There are ancestors of George Rogers Clark in the U.S. Army today. And so that's quite a little bit of a legacy, if you can imagine talking about how your family goes all the way back to the 7 Years' War in America. Well, so George Rogers Clark, he grew up being a surveyor out there in the West. He knew what was going on in the Ohio River Valley. He traveled there significantly up and down the Appalachians. He was very influential there. He was very active in that region. And most importantly, he knew how to survive and interact with the Native Americans out in that environment. So the American War of Independence comes along, and he's going to fight for the American side, obviously. So let's continue on. Let's start now talking about George Rogers Clark and his effort. So George Rogers Clark goes to the governor of Virginia. In this case, it's Patrick Henry, the guy that said, "Give me liberty or give me death." That Patrick Henry. He's the governor of Virginia at the time, and he says to the governor, "Listen, give me some men, give me some men, give me some men." And the governor kept saying, "No, if I had extra men, I would send them to General Washington, a fellow Virginian. That's who I'd send them to, not to you." But as we've seen so often in history, we have here an individual that won't take no for an answer. So George Rogers Clark kept hounding and hounding and hounding the governor of Virginia, until finally the governor of Virginia said, "Listen, I've scraped together a couple of hundred guys, 200 men. Take them and go away. I hope I never see you again. Get out." Well, this is all George Rogers Clark needed. He took this limited number of men, about 200 or so, and he trained them and trained them and trained them. Now, we've talked about this before. He had to have a professional army. But please take a strong note here. He trained them on commando-style tactics, how to stay alive out there on the frontier, how to move quietly through the woods. These really special forces sort of tactics is what he specialized in. And he trained these guys and trained them and trained them and trained them. Finally, and with that, let me draw your attention to the map. It's kind of hard to make out. Look very careful at it. You can see a dotted line leaving from Philadelphia, that kind of tan-colored dotted line, going down the Shenandoah River Valley, and then going out into the lower Ohio River Valley, into the Tennessee, and into modern-day Tennessee and Kentucky. So he's moving out into that area and picking up information. Strong note here. He wants to capture 3 British forts, and they're on the map here. So please take note of what he's going to try and capture. The first one is out there on the far left, and it's Kaskaskia, Kaskie. He wants to capture this British fort, Kaskaskia. From there, he's going to go up there and capture Cahokia, and you can see it up there, Kahokia. And the last one you can see, that blue line heading to it, is Fort Sackville, but I want you guys to know it by its French name. This has been a French fort before, and that's in the upper right. And the name of it is Vincennes. So George Rogers Clark is going to try and capture 3 British forts, Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes. So he gathers all sorts of information out there in these settlements in Kentucky. And he starts moving out there, and he's going to get ready to capture Kaskaskia. Well, he has an excellent plan. And the plan is just basically sneak up on them. Get there quickly, move fast, and arrive in an unexpected time and in an unexpected fashion. They simply waited to the fort to open up early in the morning because it's a trading post for the Native Americans. And so when Kaskaskia opened up their doors, when the fort opened up the doors, and they got ready for a day's, trading, George Rogers Clark and his guys come rushing in and took over the fort, captured it just like that. He's like, "Listen, I'm going to self-identify as Colonel George Rogers Clark, and you guys are captured, and you're my prisoners, and that's all there is to it." Well, this worked perfectly. So if it worked once, it might work again. But please understand, he's down to these 200 guys, maybe 180 guys, something like that. And he says, we've got to have men here to hold on to the fort. So he's got to jump off 50 guys. So now they're down to maybe 100 or so, whatever it is, 120 guys. And so he takes off to Cahokia. Now they've got to move fast. It's about 40, 50 miles away, and they've got to move fast. Because that region out there is populated by Native Americans in the British interest. And these Native Americans are going to get the message really quick that this fort has fallen to the Americans. So they're moving as fast as they can to Cahokia. They're going to get up there, and they're going to do the same thing again. And it worked again perfectly. They waited for the gates to open up early in the morning. The British who are inside the fort are unsuspecting. They don't know that the Americans are anywhere in that area. They rush in, capture the fort. It worked perfectly. But once again, George Rogers Clark has to leave some men behind. So he's down to maybe 70, 80 guys tops. That's all he has. He takes off towards Vincennes. Now, Vincennes is probably about 100 miles away, 70, 80, 100 miles away, something like that. And so they're moving really fast. It's getting late in the year. One of the reports has his men going through a stream, through a sort of a swamp, and they have their weapons over their head, their weapons and their gunpowder, their cartridge box over their head, and they're breaking ice with their chest to get through these swamps, these rivers. Well, the men got out of the swamp, and they said, hey, let's start a fire so we can get warmed up. And he's like, nope, because that will alert the Native Americans that we're here. We don't have time for this, and we're not going to get warmed up. Let's just run it off. And so they went, they just took off, and they kept going. It's a wonder that they all didn't die of hypothermia, but I guess they didn't have hypothermia back in them days. Anyway, finally they get to Vincennes. On the map there, it's shown as Fort Sackville, but it's Fort Vincennes. Well, the idea is the third time's a charm. Sneak up on these guys, wait for them to open up the doors, and just rush the fort. Well, in this particular case, the Native Americans had gotten the word to the British that the Americans are on the loose there and to watch out. So George Rogers Clark and his men, they get there. The gates are all closed. The British soldiers are patrolling. The cannons are all running out. They're ready for a fight. Well, it turns out that at the last second, George Rogers Clark and his guys captured some Native Americans in the British interest. Please make a note of that. At the last second, as they're about to get to Fort Vincennes, the Americans, George Rogers Clark and his guys, captured some Native Americans in the British interest. So George Rogers Clark, he takes a look at the fort, and there's like, okay, there's no way we can actually take this by assault, so we'll do it this other way. And he breaks cover, he steps out in the open, and he yells into the fort, and he says, listen, I'm Colonel George Rogers Clark, United States Army, and we have you surrounded. And there's no way out. And I want you British guys to give up immediately. You have to give up right now. Well, the British, of course, they yell out, okay, well, we're not going to do that. We're not going to give up. Go to the devil. We're not doing that. Fine. So this goes on for a second or two, and listen to me carefully. This is like one of those stories. I'm telling you right now, Hollywood can't write this stuff. It's crazy. So George Rogers Clark drags out one of these Native Americans that they had captured. And he says, he holds out a tomahawk, and he says, listen, if you guys don't give up right now, this is what's going to happen to you. And he rears back with his tomahawk, George Rogers Clark did, and hit that Native American right between the eyes with a tomahawk, with a hatchet. Killed him, graveyard dead. Bam, he's dead. And he held up the bloody tomahawk, and he yelled to the British inside the fort, give up, don't hold out. If I have to take the fort by storm, I'm going to kill every last one of you. Nobody's going to live. Well, again, the British yelled out, go away, leave us alone. So this is true now. George Rogers Clark dragged out that second Native American, and he made him kneel down, and he pulled out this tomahawk, and he said, listen, if you don't give up right now, that's what's going to happen. And he reared back, and he hit that Native American right between the eye. Whack! Well, the Native American reached up, this is true, pulled the tomahawk out of his head, handed it back to George Rogers Clark, and essentially said, you hit like a girl. Imagine that. Well, George Rogers Clark pulled that tomahawk, and he hit that Indian in the head and killed him, graveyard dead, bashed his brains right out. Well, this worked. The British gave up. And you can see that picture there in the upper right. Hairbuyer Hamilton was his nickname. He's one of these British who are paying a bounty, a price for hair brought in by the Native Americans that can be, shown to be an American, one of these rebels. And so the British gave up the forts. In other words, George Rogers Clark, what he did, that worked. Now, he had captured 3 Native Americans, and your book says this, and I kind of, I kind of disagree with it, in that George Rogers Clark cut this Native American loose to scare the other tribes. Well, that's not really what's going on. The Native American tribes in the British interest are already at war with the Americans. George Rogers Clark did cut that Native American loose to go tell the other tribes, stop fighting. Come to peace with us. Stop fighting the Americans. Don't do that anymore. Or, we're not taking any prisoners here. You guys better be thinking about what you're doing. Because the British are going to be gone, and we're here to stay. So the message does go out among the Native Americans that, you better watch out. The Americans are here. So here's what is important. Again, you can picture me jumping up and down, spits flying out. My glasses are all crazy. My tie is like over here. This is what's important. Glitter glue, LED lighting, this is what's important. By capturing those 3 forts out there on the frontier, George Rogers Clark gave us a bargaining chip at the negotiating tables. Think of your cycle of war. A war breaks out, and both sides fight to exhaustion. We're right in the middle of doing that right now. And then you have a peace treaty. Okay, so George Rogers Clark is looking ahead. By capturing these 3 forts, he's given the United States a bargaining chip at the negotiating tables later on. And this will work perfectly. This will work perfectly. So later on, what we're going to get is what's called the Northwest Territory. Please write that down. Later on at the negotiating tables, this is going to work, and we're going to get what's called the Northwest Territory. Later on still, that'll be called the Old Northwest. You'll see that in your textbooks like several times. So, continue on with strong notes. The Northwest Territory will turn into the modern states of, and I have a list for you, write it down. The modern states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. I will say all that again. By capturing Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes, George Rogers Clark gave us a bargaining chip at the negotiating tables. That worked perfectly, and it turned into the modern states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. So the consequences here are George Rogers Clark, with 200 or so men, got all of that territory, got all of those modern states. And that is the consequences. Those are huge consequences, as you can imagine. So with that in mind, okay, now we're still on the middle phase of the war. We're still in the middle phase of the war. So let's transition, go to the next slide, and talk about the war at sea. Now what we're talking about on this slide is the war at sea. And I have to say that as a historian, I'm very, very, very frustrated at most textbooks, because they don't even mention the war at sea. But the United States is a seafaring nation, and we've always been a seafaring nation. The ocean's a highway, not a barrier. I've said that 100 times in class. And so the idea that they're not going to talk about the war at sea, that's just, it's a huge, it's a hole in the way we present the American War of Independence. The war at sea is extremely important to us. So, middle phase of the war. 2 phases. Phase 1, the landward side, that was George Rogers Clark, and now the Navy part. And the Navy, or the war at sea, is divided itself into 2 parts. The war at sea is divided into 2 parts. One of them is the effort of the privateers, and the other is the regular United States Navy. So I have the phrase up there. It's in the caption, privateers. So let's talk about what's really going on here. A privateer is also referred to as a letter of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E. This is short for a letter of marque and reprisal. It is in your Constitution, Article 1, Section 10. Congress can still issue a letter of marque and reprisal. They can do that. That is not a dead part of the Constitution. And what a privateer, also known as a letter of marque, is, it's basically legalized piracy. Now that sounds like an oxymoron. That sounds like a double negative or something. It's legalized piracy. What a letter of marque and reprisal does is it is a permission slip from Congress, or occasionally from the states, that allows an ordinary merchant ship to put cannons onto his merchant vessel and go attack enemy merchant ships. This is huge. A letter of marque and reprisal, also referred to as a privateer. allows a ship captain on a regular merchant ship to get a permission slip from Congress or from the individual states. They can put cannons on board their ships. Most ships had cannons back in those days anyway, but they can put cannons on board their ships and then go attack enemy merchant ships. Now, I've done a lot of homework on this. A lot of other people have done a lot of homework on this. This is like a really, really big deal. When I was doing a research trip back to England, I went to an insurance company called Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's is not the only insurance company that was active back then. That's still with us today. But I went to them. They're the easiest ones to get to. Well, I went down to their archives and said, listen, I want to do a little bit of research. And I had my ID card. And they said, okay, knock yourself out. And I said, bring me the books that start from like 1775 and go all the way to 1881. And they said, well, you're one of those guys. So I'm not the only one that's doing this research. Well, they brought out these gigantic books. And, you know, you open them up, and on the far left, it has the name of the ship. And then there'll be a bunch of columns. It's like an Excel spreadsheet sort of thing. Anyway, one column will say, okay, what does the ship look like? Another column will say, you know, when was it launched? When was this happen? When did that happen? And then on the far right, it would say final disposition. You know, was it sold to somebody else? Was it broken up for scrap? Was it lost at sea? Well, as I started going through this, when I got down to the American War of Independence, it started slowly, obviously, and then it went on. But after a while, the entry started saying, captured by the Americans, captured by the Americans, captured by the Americans, captured by the Americans, burned at sea, lost at sea, captured by the Americans, captured by the French, captured by the Americans. And when I got to 2000, I stopped counting. It went on from there. Plus, please understand that there's other insurance companies that I just didn't have time to check while I was over there doing research. And as you can imagine, there's little mom and pop ships. They're going to decide, listen, we can go to sail and go to sea and do our thing and risk not having insurance. So I have up there circa 2,500 British merchant ships were captured during the war. Well, that's a lot. England is an island nation. They depend upon trade by the sea, absolutely depend upon that. That is their lifeline. So let's put this into practical application. Now listen to me carefully. You know, you don't have to write down strong notes on this, but keep it in mind, which I know I say that a lot, and it usually means, you know, write down strong notes. So here you go. With the Treaty of Commerce, Amity and Commerce, and the Treaty of Alliance, that means, listen to me now, American privateers can use French harbors. So American privateers will go to France. They'll sail out of French harbors. They'll go right there to England, which is it's right across the English Channel. There it is. And they'll just raid all these British ships, one after another after another. Then they can take that captured ship, listen to me, take it into a friendly port. In this case, the French coast, and very often into the Dutch coast. Then sell the ship, sell the cargo, cut the crew loose, the British crew, cut them loose, and keep the money. You're supposed to give part of the money to Congress or to the states, but nobody ever actually did that. Well, immediately, you know, the next day, you set sail, you go out there and capture another British merchant ship. Drag it into a French harbor, drag it into a Dutch harbor, sell the ship, sell the cargo, cut the crew loose, and go do it again. As you can imagine, if you're a lucky commander and you have a tough, resourceful crew, you can make a fortune out of this, like right away. And it's all perfectly legal. Now that's kind of the superficial version of it, but I want you guys to dig a little bit deeper. Now think, think, think. I know I say that all the time, and I want you to think. So many of these ships are owned by large shipping companies. The East India Company is one of them. There are several others. And so if you're capturing all of these corporate ships, not just mom and pops, although you're going to capture those as well, if you're capturing these larger ships, these more important ships, think what happens to insurance values. Insurance rates skyrocket immediately. It's a war. And these Americans are going over there and capturing a whole bunch of your ships. And so insurance rates go skyrocketing right away. Well, these corporations are not going to pay that themselves. They're going to pay up front, but they're going to pass the cost to the consumer. That means that the goods increased in price like right away to cover the insurance cost, which means that the cost of living in England went up significantly like right away. But wages did not follow that up. Suddenly everything got really, really expensive in England, but nobody's paying any more money, which means that these big corporations, they're not making any money. It's hitting the British right in their pocketbook. Write that down. Strong note. Because these privateers capturing British ships, insurance rates goes up, and the cost of living in England goes way, way up right away, immediately. Well, in Parliament, this is a connection. Here's the connection. Here's what's important. In Parliament, many of the members of Parliament are stockholders in these shipping companies. They're stockholders in some of these mom and pop ships that are out there. They're owners of them, part owners in these. And they're seeing that their livelihood is being destroyed. Even if they're not part of that, part owner or a stockholder, they can see that the cost of living is going up, insurance is going up, and it's hurting the people in England. And so these privateers, these letters of marque and reprisal, make Parliament want to end the war. That is the biggest of the big things. That's like critically important. Privateering, letters of marque and reprisal, makes Parliament want to end the war. They didn't really want the war in the first place. Now it's hitting them right in their pocketbook, and I mean personally. They want to end the war. So those are the consequences. Now we're in phase 2 of the war, the middle phase. We're talking about the war at sea, which is divided up into 2 parts. Now we've talked about privateers, let's talk about the Navy. And for the Navy, there is a difference. The Navy is not fighting for money, they're fighting for honor. Please write that down. The Navy is fighting for honor. And our icon is none other than John Paul Jones. His name is up there at the top of that verbiage up there, and that's his picture there on the right. A sidebar on this, that's actually very, very much what he looked like. Kind of a weird story on this guy. When he died, he was actually buried in France. And they had him entombed in France. And he stayed there for decades and decades and decades, years and years and years. But finally the Navy was like, the U.S. Navy was like, listen, we want our guy back. And so the French were like, well, he's your guy, come and get him. So we sent a battleship all the way to France. This is just before World War I. And we sent a battleship over there and retrieved his body. And while that was happening, somewhere along the line, somebody got out a camera and took a picture of the guy. And it turns out that his body, his corpse, was really, really super well preserved from being dead for almost 120 years. And so from that corpse, somebody did that picture that you see right there, and I'm telling you right now, that's what he looked like. Now, I urge you in the strongest conceivable language, and I genuinely do mean this, do not Google that picture. Unless you've got the stomach to see a guy that's been dead for a long, long time, don't do it. You cannot unsee that. Take it from me, that's what John Paul Jones looked like. So with that kind of sidebar in mind, that out of the way, I guess, let's talk about John Paul Jones. He was born John Paul in Scotland. And what's important about that here is that the Scottish at the time when he was born, 1750s, they were really antagonistic towards Great Britain. There'd been a rebellion in 1715, there'd been another one in 1745. And so there was a lot of people in Scotland that were like really antagonistic towards Britain because of those uprisings. So growing up, he was hearing bad things about England. Occasionally it still goes on in Scotland even to this day. Well, fine. He goes into the merchant service. He's a qualified ship captain. He's been at sea his whole life long. And he's got all this like latent antagonism towards Great Britain. And then the war broke out. Well, our guy, John Paul Jones, goes to France, and he talks to none other than Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, I'm telling you right now, that guy's everywhere. And Ben Franklin says, okay, he says to Ben Franklin, listen, I want to be part of the United States Navy. I want to do this. I want to be involved. Ben Franklin says, okay, great. So John Paul Jones goes to America with a letter of introduction from Ben Franklin. In America, they give John Paul Jones, they make him an admiral, a captain, they make him a captain in the Navy right away. But then they say, listen, we don't happen to have a ship for you. You're a captain in the United States Navy, fine. You're going to have to find your own ship. Well, John Paul Jones says, okay, I got that worked out. I already know the solution to that. So he did change his name to John Paul Jones to kind of hide his identity. Please understand he's from Great Britain, Scotland. And if he got caught by the British, they'd be hanging him as a traitor. So he changed his name, not very creative, if you ask me, from John Paul to John Paul Jones. Fine. Well, he got back to France, and he said to Ben Franklin, contacted him again, and said, hey, listen, I need a ship. And Ben Franklin, man, he was right on the money. He went to the King of France and said, listen, I got a guy here that needs a ship. And the King of France said, well, bang, here you go, here's your ship. So John Paul Jones got, and write this down, he got an old banged up French merchant ship. And he scraped together a crew, basically a bunch of, beat up privates, disaffected guys, French, some were German, some were Dutch, a few Americans, even some English guys. And he said, okay, we're going to have this, this warship. And he renamed it the Bonhomme Richard. And there you see the name of it down there in that yellow block, Bonhomme Richard. And Bonhomme Richard is a sort of a signal. It is an homage to Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin's big publication was Poor Richard's Almanac. And the translation of Poor Richard's Almanac is Bonhomme Richard. So John Paul Jones rebuilds this merchant ship, puts holes in the side of it so you can shoot cannons out, basically like a window sort of thing, so you can shoot a cannon out of it. Reinforces it, and he sets to sea. And he's looking for the British. Now, strong note here, very strong note here. Listen to me carefully. In order to avoid all these privateers, in order to counteract what they're doing, the British switched to a convoy system. That is to say, and this is extremely expensive to do, but they'll have a bunch of ships held at a destination, and they'll say, okay, all you British ships, hold up here until we got a whole bunch of you, and then we'll assign a Navy ship, and we'll convoy you to Great Britain. If you're in Great Britain, you got to wait until you get a whole bunch of ships going to the same destination, and assign a Royal Navy ship to escort them out, escort the convoy out. So sure enough, the HMS Serapis, it spells Serapis, but don't say it that way. It's a French word. It's named after a sea spirit sort of thing. The HMS Serapis, she was guarding this convoy. Now the Bonhomme Richard sails out there, found this convoy, ran into the HMS Serapis. Now the HMS Serapis, a regular Royal Navy ship, built from the ground up as a frigate. And they start fighting out, Bonhomme Richard versus the Serapis, and they shoot and shoot and shoot. And that picture there in the center of the slide there, that's pretty accurate. They're gonna I don't know, some of these fights that you see in Pirates of the Caribbean or something. They're just gonna get yard arm to yard arm and just start winging cannonballs at each other, the size of bowling balls, like big giant cannonballs. And they shoot and shoot and shoot. At one point they drifted apart, threw over the dead bodies, knotted and spliced all the sails back together, and drifted back together again, and shot it out. At one point, evidently, the British commander yelled over, have you guys given up? Are you ready to throw in the towel? And John Paul Jones famously said, sir, we have not yet begun to fight. Here they were, all shot to pieces, and he's yelling across, no, this fight ain't even started, pal. Let's go ahead and lock horns. And so they went back to shooting. Well, eventually, the HMS Serapis gave up. They struck their colors. They said, okay, we give up. John Paul Jones got into a small boat, rowed over there, had his men row him over there, got on board the HMS Serapis and said, listen, are you sure you guys gave up? Okay, well, I'll take your swords as a symbol of your surrender. And the British like, yeah, we give up. Okay, fine. Here's our swords. We give up. He says, good, because my guy's got to come over here because my ship is sinking. And the Bonhomme Richard, a few hours later, went straight to the bottom of the channel, and that's where she's at today. Here's what's important. Our Navy is in it to win it. Our Navy can never overcome the Royal Navy. But our guys are in it to win it. But here is the important thing. Please make a strong note here. If the privateers are in English waters, then the Royal Navy has to be in English waters protecting their trade. Continue on the strong notes. Now think. So if the Royal Navy is in English waters protecting their trade, they're not in American waters, stopping the trade, blockading the harbors. All right, fine. So the privateers can't do anything in England. Listen to me. They'll simply go to the Caribbean. They'll go to the Mediterranean, and they'll do their privateering there. Well, then the Royal Navy has to go to the Caribbean. They've got to go to the Mediterranean. And if the Royal Navy is in the Caribbean or the Mediterranean, they're not in American waters. So trade, that ocean's a highway, not a barrier, that highway to America is open. And the United States can get, military supplies from all over the place. They can go ahead and get that. They can take goods that they've made and ship that overseas and make a little bit of money on the side. The Royal Navy can't be everywhere. The United States is never going to overcome the Royal Navy. We couldn't do that until the 20th century if we wanted to. We couldn't. We would always be allied. After the War of 1812, we'll be allied with Great Britain. More about that later. So we're never going to overcome the Royal Navy. We won't. But we can keep the trade open. The Royal Navy is just being run ragged. And so what are the consequences? Once again, Parliament wants to end the war. The war at sea is consequential and has huge impact. Again, you can kind of see now why I'm so frustrated by textbooks that talk about the American War of Independence and don't even mention the war at sea. It just drives me crazy. You can't do that. The consequences of privateers and the consequences of the effect of the United States Navy means that Great Britain wants to end the war. Parliament wants to end the war. The defeat of the Serapis, by the Bonhomme Richard sent shockwaves around the world. Here was this beat-up merchant vessel defeating a regular Royal Navy ship. Now, John Paul Jones was a hero to our side, certainly. I want to be clear, the captain of the Serapis was also a hero to their side because the merchant convoy he's protecting got to England. They said, yeah, you lost your ship, but the convoy got through. Good for you. They celebrated that guy, promoted him. He lost his ship, but he did it with honor, doing what he was supposed to do. Captain Lawrence, I think, was his name. It doesn't matter. Yes? So our Navy, they're in it to win it. And the war at sea is consequential. This has huge consequences. So with all that in mind, again, phase 2 of the war, I've talked about a couple of battles here, and then I've talked about, what the consequences are. So with that in mind, let's go ahead, go on to the next slide, and I believe we're going to be talking about politics for a few minutes. So here we go. Let's talk about politics for a little while. Now, strong note here because, and don't go to sleep on me now. Strong note here because this will be consequential later on. Now, in 1776, we're going to split from Great Britain. Declaration of Independence, it had consequences. And so that means we've got to form our own government. We actually have to have a document, got to work out our own government. We're going to figure out how we're going to pull together and defeat the British and form our own nation. And so this is a matter of practical application. And the answer is going to be very ad hoc. That is the good Roman Latin phrase, and you need to learn it, ad hoc. And ad hoc basically means we make it up as we go. Ad hoc. On the way. Yes? And the result then is the Arts Confederation. So let me start here by putting this in the right context. Our first Constitution was the English Constitution as it then existed. As a reminder, and we've already gone over this in class, as a reminder, the English Constitution is that body of laws on the books and in effect at any given time. Well, under that period of salutary neglect, Parliament and the colonies agreed that the colonies are English, but they may govern themselves. But then the English Constitution began to change. In that period between 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War, and the beginning of the American War of Independence, 1775, Parliament became more and more assertive. They insisted on centralizing power. And our guys don't like that. The English Constitution changed. We've talked about that. And it had a negative impact on the colonies, and they did not like it. So imagine, if you will, this is a pendulum. At first, the pendulum is all the way to one side, where the English Constitution is really easy to deal with. But then the pendulum swung to the other side. And the English Constitution became very difficult to deal with. It became centralizing. It centralized power in London. And we did not like that. So here we are with the Arts Confederation, and the pendulum is swinging back to the other side. We want a weak central government. Please write that down. In total, the Arts Confederation represent a weak central government. So we make it up as we go. The Arts Confederation are finally agreed to in 1778, but then they come to an end in 1787. And that's why we're going to talk about it now, because we'll have to get rid of it later in 1787, and we will do that. So the Arts Confederation is our second constitution. Our first constitution was the English Constitution. The Arts Confederation is our second constitution. It is a weak central government, no executive. There's no executive branch at all. There are 10 successive presidents of Congress, but they are basically appointees, or they volunteered to do the job. They have no real authority. You know, somebody gives them a gavel and says, okay, try and keep control of this thing. Well, that's impossible. The legislature is also very, very weak because power resided in the states. We've talked about this before. The local elites don't want to give up their authority. We've talked about that. So the legislature is also very weak. An example, they have no control of the army after 1787. That is to say, the army is going to go back to the states. The army as it then existed is not a creation of the government. It is a sort of a nationalization of the state militias. Well, in this Arts Confederation, it says in 1787, no matter what, there's no army at all. It's going to go back to the states. In other words, all the militiamen will go back to the states. Well, what's going to happen, very briefly here, is that the states are going to get their militia back, and they're going to identify that as a cost, and they're simply going to disband those guys. So there's no military at all. And that's weak. That's a very weak central government. So the next bullet point here, the corollary to this, the flip side of this is, each state was, in effect, its own nation. They could do whatever they wanted. And the central government had no say on that. This is states' rights gone mad. But we were reacting to a strong central government under the last part of the English Constitution. We didn't like that. A restricted ability to tax, that's the next bullet point there. The Arts Confederation can only ask for a contribution from the states. Well, again, here's the way the states saw that. The states will say, listen, we have our own budget. You know, we have that. We have a treasury. We have all that stuff. All that stuff's set up. And we have our own government. We have our own budget. And there's nothing left over in our budget to give to the central government to fight the war. And so, none of the states really want to give any contributions to help fight the war. They'll all say, okay, we'll just do that at the state level. Well, then they don't do it at the state level either. And this is detrimental to the war effort. The only thing that really saved us was the French, and we've already talked about that. The next bullet point, again, weak central government. Any change required the unanimous agreement of the 13 states. Well, there's no way that these 13 states are going to agree with anything. They won't agree that the sky is blue. They won't agree that, nighttime is dark. They're not going to agree that fire is hot. They won't agree to that. Usually the holdout was the smaller states, Rhode Island and New Hampshire. And they are what's called the Hampshire plantations. And they hold out on everything. They're like, listen, we want something else. We want a deal. We want something from you other guys because we're small states and we don't have a whole lot of say. So they keep holding out, trying to get a better deal for themselves. Well, that means, again, nothing can be done. The next bullet point, no provisions for new states, except for Canada. There is a paragraph in there that says, if we can grab Canada, we can grab Canada. Now, let me be clear on something. We're going to try and grab Canada on like 4 separate occasions. 3 for sure, and I think a 4th time in the 1830s. We're going to try to grab it again. And I have no earthly idea on this planet why the United States wanted to continue to grab Canada. There were no resources up there. There's a bunch of angry French people up there that are left over from the 7 Years' War, and they basically wanted independence from everybody. There's like no assets up there. There's no resources up there. So why we wanted to grab Canada, I don't know. Nobody has a real clear explanation on that. But they thought it was a good idea at the time. All right, fine. No ability to regulate commerce. Now this is a lot more consequential than you think. To be clear, there's no judiciary either. So if there's a dispute between the colonies, it can't get worked out. Between the states, it can't get worked out. Furthermore, and again, we just don't think about these things today. At the time, there was different currencies in the different states. Each state had its own currency, and the currency was issued and guaranteed by the local banks. They're called banknotes. And so in the Northeast, they still spoke of pounds and shillings and pence, and basically it's based on kind of like English money. It is not English money. It's, from Massachusetts or New York or Rhode Island or Connecticut or whoever. But they still speak of pounds and shillings and pence. However, in the South, in Georgia and the Carolinas, they're kind of like, Spanish leaning. And the Spanish and the Dutch in particular, they have dollars. They have cents. They have dimes and nickels. And so they have a completely different currency, and it's a different setup. So there's no way for the central government to regulate that. Later on, when we have the Constitution of 1787, that will be like up front. That's going to be very, very clear in Article 1, Section 8, this ability to regulate commerce and to establish the value of money. That's like written in there several times. Last but not least, this Constitution will last until 1787. So it encroaches upon the Treaty of 1783 later on. But what I really want you guys to get out of this Arts Confederation, very ad hoc, make it up as you go, and above all, it is a reaction to a strong central government from London. And so when we had an opportunity to write our own Constitution in 1778, we made it very, very weak. We made the central government is going to be very, very weak. We are going to discover that will not work, which is why the Arts Confederation have a very limited lifespan. Please make sure you take a note on that. In the picture there on the right, you can kind of see the guys that are instrumental in the Arts Confederation. They're kind of making it up as they go. It's Hamilton, Jefferson, Morris. And Hamilton and Morris, they were both Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton. They were the money guys. And they kept saying, okay, let's take a look at this from a financial standpoint. And they kept saying a weak central government, that allows commerce to just go and do their own thing. In other words, commerce is not really going to be taxed. Furthermore, Jefferson, he kept saying weak central government because he was always afraid of a tyranny. He was afraid of somebody like rising up and being the king. He was always terrified of that sort of thing. He keeps saying that. So they have their own reasons, and good reasons, for wanting a weak central government. But it will not work out that way. So with that in mind, let's head on to the next slide. Again, I've talked about some battles, and I've talked about the consequences of that. Now we have something else to talk about, the Arts Confederation. And now we're going to move forward and talk about the closing phase of the war, phase 3 of the war. Okay, phase 3 of the war. This is Cornwallis' campaign in the southern United States. It's sometimes referred to as the Southern Campaign. More commonly, it's referred to as the Yorktown Campaign. So I have up there Cornwallis' campaign in the South, but this is really known as the Yorktown Campaign. Yorktown is spelled in the map, on the map there at the very top, Yorktown. Now let's start with the definition. Please write this down in gigantic letters. Like, again, underline this. Make sure you emphasize this in your notes. The classic definition of a campaign in military speak. A campaign is a series of battles that has a significant outcome. You can have a whole series of battles that doesn't mean anything, and then all you have is one battle after another, and you're disconnected. But here we have a series of battles that leads to a significant outcome. And the main idea on the Yorktown campaign is it will lead to the end of the war. And that makes what I'm about to point out very, very important. The Yorktown campaign, the Southern campaign, Cornwallis' campaign in the South, all three of the same things, this will lead to the end of the war. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Now, I pointed out before in the first half of the American War of Independence and in the other presentation that the British were really suffering from too many generals, and they were. They had Clinton, they had Burgoyne, who's going to lose, General Howe, he will get really, really fed up. He knew what was going on in America, and he'd beaten Washington on several occasions, but he goes back to England. He's really, really fed up with what's going on, and they still have a whole lot of generals they have to deal with. But one of them is General Lord Cornwallis. Now, Cornwallis was a military professional. He'd been in the Army his entire life long, and he'd done really, really, really well. He'd done okay all the way back in the 7 Years' War, and he's really a well-respected, highly professional, highly competent general. Now, your book will point out that the beginning of this campaign, General Clinton is also involved, and that is true. But for the purposes of my presentation here, we're going to stick with Cornwallis. So please make sure you understand that distinction in your book. For the purpose of this class, we're just going to keep it down. We're going to keep it as simple as we can, and it's going to be Cornwallis. So Cornwallis has been involved in the earlier fighting. He had beat General Washington at Brandywine, defeated him on several other occasions. And the problem was, however, that Cornwallis, for all of his attributes, could not finish General Washington off. He couldn't, close in and, end it. At the last minute, Washington, again, he's our finest general ever, he would always manage to get away. So the war's going on and on and on. Again, here it is, 1781. The war's been going on since 1775. Oh, it's just a nightmare, and everybody's getting, really genuinely war weary. Well, Lord Cornwallis suffered a personal tragedy. Friends and other family members started writing him letters saying, listen, your wife is really, really sick, and evidently she's hiding that from you, but you need to come back to England and see to this. Well, Cornwallis, he actually had a genuine love affair with his wife. He loved her dearly. They had a very caring relationship. And so he went on leave and went back home to England. And tragically, his wife died. From what I can understand, from what I can tell, it's kind of hard to make these things out, but the supposition was it was probably breast cancer. And that's a very, very difficult way to go. So I tried to get her all fixed up, but there's just no way to survive that terrible affliction. Back in those days, it just wasn't going to happen. But what's important here is while Cornwallis was back in England, he had time to really think about what's going on in the war in America. And he considered what was happening, and he looked it all over, and he exhibited his powers of analysis, and he said, you know what, I think I got a solution for this. Well, his wife passed away, and he went back to the king, and he said, listen, thank you for letting me come home on leave. She passed away. It was very tragic. The king really did take this sincerely. We think of King George III as a really evil man. That's not true. He was very, very sensitive. And he felt, Lord Cornwallis's loss very keenly. But then Cornwallis said, listen, the army is my life. I have nothing left. My children are all grown up. They're all adults, and I have nothing left but the army. So let me go back to America and finish this off. Well, of course, the king said, I'll do what you want done. I'm going to help you out with this. So Cornwallis goes back. And the plan is, strong note, the plan is to take the main part of the British Army, go down to the south. That's the Southern Campaign. And the supposition is, strong note here, that all the people in the South, the Americans living in the South, are actually strong loyalists. Cornwallis says, listen, they haven't really helped the Northeast. They haven't gone up there in any big numbers. And that seems to strongly suggest that there's a lot of loyalists in those southern states. Now, we all know that's not true. Every town and village, as I pointed out before, is divided up 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And so it's not true that the southern states were loyalist. It's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So Cornwallis misread the situation. However, Clinton and Sir Thomas Gage and all the other generals said, you know what, that's actually a pretty good idea. We'll go do that. We'll go down to the south, win a few victories, get a whole bunch of loyalists, and we'll just work our way right up the coast. And we'll gather more and more loyalists along the way, and then Washington and these rebels, they will be defeated. They'll be destroyed. So, sure enough, they packed up the main part of the fighting British army. They left by sea. They took to the sea, the Ocean Highway, not a barrier, and they took off. Strong note here. Now, General Washington ordinarily knew exactly what was going on at British headquarters because he had a very extensive spy network. We're really not too clear on that. A lot of books have been written on it, but even those are vague, and that's the nature of an espionage network. It's not really clear. But evidently, the housekeeper for General Clinton was actually a spy for the Americans. So the housekeeper, they're all over the place, and they're listening all the time. They're taking a look at documents. They knew exactly what was going on. But this time, the British acted so fast, they loaded up their guys on ships and set sea, that Washington didn't know what was going on. That'll be important in a minute. So Washington sent letters up and down the coast to every military commander. Watch out for the British. Watch out for the British. Watch out for the British. We don't know what they're doing. Sure enough, Cornwallis, along with General Clinton, they arrived in Savannah, Georgia. Now, Savannah, Georgia was a very, very important port city back in those days. Think of the triangular trade. If you recall, all those ships were coming from the Caribbean, going to America, and taking all those truck vegetables and going back to the Caribbean. So the Savannah, Georgia was a very, very important port city back in those days. And Cornwallis arrived by sea along with Clinton, and they captured Savannah, Georgia, just like that. Bang, got it. So, again, strong note here. Right away, the British plan seems to be working. Now, Cornwallis went by land, the Royal Navy goes by sea, and they go to Charleston. On the American side, we get a general down there. Benjamin Lincoln was his name. You'll run into him later on. So, Ben Lincoln. Benjamin Lincoln shows up in Charleston. He's a super good officer. He's studied it really, really hard. He's worked very hard to be a very, very good officer. Washington trusts him implicitly, and Ben Lincoln's down there in Charleston to hold things down, keep it pulled together. Now, it is unfortunate that he had a sort of an affliction, narcolepsy, and so he'd be talking to some of the guys, he'd be making plans, and then suddenly this narcolepsy business would kick in, and he would go to sleep. And 5, 10 minutes later, 30 minutes later, he'd wake up as though nothing had happened. which as a leader, you can imagine this is very disconcerting. That's just the nature of it. On the other hand, he was a very, very good leader. He was known to be like, go out there, talk to the troops, and if they're doing heavy work, as the general, he would like take off his jacket and pitch in and do the heavy work. He would help them. So the soldiers really did like Ben Lincoln, and he had, a lot of morale. Well, Cornwallis arrives by land, the Royal Navy arrives by sea, and they send a message in, strong note now. Cornwallis sent in a message across the lines. Observe that he didn't send the message to Ben Lincoln. He sent the message to the good people of Charleston, South Carolina. And he said, listen, if you don't give up right now, the Royal Navy is going to shell you by sea, and I'm going to shell you by land, and we're going to burn your city to the ground. We're going to declare you all to be rebels, and we'll destroy your city. Ben Lincoln finds out about this, and he tells everybody, hang on, reinforcements are coming, which was true. At the last minute, another 3,000 men show up, trained regular Army guys. And Ben Lincoln's like, listen, we can hold on. We can fend these guys off. Once again, Cornwallis sends another message through the lines to the city of Charleston, South Carolina, says, give up now. I'm going to blow you all to pieces. And the people of Charleston, South Carolina chickened out. I'm sorry to say it that way, but that's what happened. And they went to Ben Lincoln and said, we're not going to support you anymore. We're not going to give you food. We're not going to give you equipment. We're not going to help you. No more. You're done. So it's unfortunate that Ben Lincoln had to give up. But think of Cornwallis's plan. This looks like his original plan had worked. That the people of the South were, in fact, loyalists, which wasn't true. Now, at this point, Clinton goes back up to goes back up to New York. He actually had a mistress up there. He wanted to be playing around with her, and that's fine. But that leaves Cornwallis down there in Charleston, South Carolina. And he is, so far, victorious. Strong note now, he heads inland. And they go to the next battle, which you can see that big red dot there, at the Battle of Camden. Now, Washington is like struggling to find a commander to go down there. And Congress says, send down there none other than, strong note, Horatio Gates. Congress insists on Washington sending Horatio Gates down there. Washington said, no, I don't think this is the right guy. He's getting too old. He's too cautious. He's not the right guy. But Congress insisted. Okay, so Horatio Gates is down there. He's got 2,000 or 3,000 guys. They're ready to fight the battle. On the day of the battle, they're all lined up. The cannons are all sitting there. Everybody's shoulder to shoulder. They're facing the British. The British, they too are all lined up. The cannons are all ready to go. Flags are all snapping in the breeze. You can imagine the drums beating. And Horatio Gates took one long hard look at the British Army, and my hand to God, he got on his horse and took off over the hill as fast as he could go. One account has him not stopping for 3 days. He rode to the north, just took off. Like some dog that got hit. Well, imagine, if you will, you're on the battlefield, and on the American side, suddenly the general's gone, and you look to the left and look to the right, and all the officers are well, who's in charge? What's the plan? What do we do now? The soldiers are looking around. What do we do now? What's up? The general's gone. When are we going to get some orders? On the British side, they can easily see what's going on, and Cornwallis times it just right, and sure enough, Camden is a catastrophic defeat for the Americans. Camden is a huge defeat for the Americans. Now, Washington wanted Horatio Gates hunted down and shot. He said so. He was livid. He was absolutely furious. Here's an American general that ran away from the immediate presence of the enemy. But Congress, again, I don't know who he had as friends in Congress, but Congress again stepped in and saved Horatio Gates, and he was not shot. He was kicked out of the army, but he should have been, they should have executed that guy, but that's not what happened. Okay, so the next battle is Mary's Cowpens and Kings Mountain. There's another battle called 96. We're going to skip those. We're going to go to Gulfport Courthouse. So, strong note here. We got rid of one really bad general, Horatio Gates. But we got 2 really good generals in return. Daniel Morgan and Nathaniel Greene. Now, Daniel Morgan had tremendous leadership power. He was really good at the fighting down there. He knew everybody. Everybody knew him. He was wily and courageous. He had a lot of tremendous assets that helped us out. The problem is that he also suffered really badly from arthritis that was attacking his lower back. So essentially, his lower vertebrae and the small of his back going into his hip bones, they were all falling apart and disintegrating, which means that you have these jagged hunks of bone hanging around down there, stabbing all your nerves. And so the only way that he could deal with the pain was to drink a lot of a new drink called whiskey and stay drunk all the time. While he was, not drunk, he was giving clear instructions, and they were really good, and everybody was paying attention to what he said. But then he couldn't stand the pain, so he had to get drunk. Well, so Daniel Morgan did as best he could, but eventually he has to go. And that left us with Nathaniel Greene. And Nathaniel Greene is an amazing general. He's very resourceful, well respected by the men, very much a hands-on general. The story goes that the night before the battle, he goes from camp to camp, and he's shaking hands with the guys, calling them by name, asking them if they have plenty of food, if they have all the tools they need to fight with. But we have part of his force is made up of the regular army, trained regular infantry. And part of his force is made up of militia. And militia, we're not too good with militia. We're not too confident in those guys. But Nathaniel Greene told his guys, listen, all I want you to do is shoot 3 aimed shots, and then you can go home. And he's shaking hands, he's talking to them directly, he's asking them to help him out. And if somebody asks for your help, you invariably give it. You just do that. The day of the battle, sure enough, Cornwallis, his guys are all lined up, they're ready to go, they're ready to fight. They've been fed basically on a diet of victory, and they're ready to go. So the militia got out there in front, the American militia got out there in front, and sure enough, they shot 3 aimed shots right at the British, which was devastating to the British Army. Really, shot down a bunch of them. And then they fell back, went through the lines of the regular American infantry, which then stepped up and started shooting. Ladies and gentlemen, what occurred next is nothing less than a minor miracle. The militia, they talked it over, and instead of going home, they got right back up into the fighting line and fought like they were regular, trained infantry. And for Nathaniel Greene, this is an unexpected reinforcement. He wasn't expecting that extra 700, 1,200 guys, however many it was, to go ahead and add their force, add their musket fire in the battle. He wasn't expecting that. So they fought and fought and fought, and it was a long, hard fighting day. The battle went on for hours and hours and hours. One account has soldiers on both sides, particularly on the British side, dying from heat exhaustion. They're out there fighting, and they're going for it, and there's no wind, and it's really, really a burning, blazing hot day. And, they're dehydrated, and they just keel over dead from heat exhaustion. But the reason why I have that as a red dot up there is that Nathaniel Greene did, in fact, call a halt to the battle, and then they retreated. So the battle was technically, it is a British victory. But observe, ladies and gentlemen, that all the British got out of the Battle of Guildford Courthouse was a field full of dead bodies. Nathaniel Greene was able to escape with the army and fight another day. He crosses several rivers, destroys all the boats, gets all the boats on the other side of the river, especially the Dan River, and that means that the British have no way to pursue. Strong note now, on the British side, Cornwallis knows that he has to get to the sea. He has to get to the sea. He has to get resupplied. And so they march away from Guildford Courthouse, and they go to Yorktown. From Guildford Courthouse, Cornwallis is going to go to Yorktown. So with that in mind, let's go to the next slide. We're going to finish off the war. So here we are. Now, this is the end of the Yorktown Campaign, 1781. Now, Nathaniel Greene got joined up by reinforcements, and they're led, as you can see on the map there on the left, by Lafayette. I told you we were going to run into Lafayette again, and now we are. So Lafayette is down there. He's got reinforcements. He's in charge. He's there with Nathaniel Greene. They're working together really, really well. Good cooperation. Strong note now, Lafayette sends a letter to Rochambeau, and Nathaniel Greene is going to send a letter to Washington. And they say to Washington and Rochambeau, listen, we've got the British pinned down against the sea. Write that down. We've got the British pinned down against the sea, but we don't have enough force to finish them off. What do you want us to do? Now, that's a very good question. The letter gets up to Washington and Rochambeau, and they discuss it. They're up there in White Plains. Again, take a look at the map on the left. And they are watching General Clinton and the main British force in New York City, in and around New York, on the Jersey side and in New York. Now, this is what I was talking about before when I talked about Rochambeau. General Washington can make a decision, but here he is faced with several important decisions. To stay up there and watch the main British army, or to go down there and fight in Yorktown. And Rochambeau comes to him and says, listen, you're right. Watching the main British army in New York, that there may be something there, and maybe we'll get an opportunity. But if you defeat Cornwallis at Yorktown, it will lead to the end of the war. General Washington can make decisions, but Rochambeau can tell the important from the critical. And it's just a matter of his training. There's nothing bad on Washington here. Washington listened to Rochambeau. Again, good on him. And he said, okay, we'll go down to Yorktown. And so begins this epic march. Now, I'm going to get on a little sidebar here, and here I'm going to get on, unabashedly, I'm going to get on my soapbox. So just get ready for a little speech. The men are marching down through there. They're heading on down there. It's flaming hot. It's the middle of the summer, 1781, and they've got, about 1,000 miles to march. The picture that you see in the upper left, that is what those guys probably look like. This is from the collection of the Mary S.K. Brown Library. These are soldiers drawn from life. You see on the left of that picture, that's an artilleryman. In the middle is what most American soldiers actually look like. He's wearing what's called a hunting shirt. It's a very practical garment, very inexpensive to make up. You can see that guy there in the brown uniform. That's actually British red that has been captured, British cloth, and it's been re-dyed brown. And that makes it really inexpensive and, useful for our guys. But there in the all-white is one of 2 regiments sent by Rhode Island. And it is the only depiction of black soldiers who fought for the American side in the American War of Independence. And Rhode Island sent 2 regiments of those guys down there to fight. And so that is the only picture in all of American history of a black soldier fighting for the United States in the American War of Independence. They did fight. They had a contribution. Well, our guys are marching, and they have to go through Philadelphia. Very quick on this story. But this is me on my soapbox, I'm telling you right now. As the guest of honor, we allowed the French to go through first. And imagine, if you will, the French army, beautifully accoutered. They have beautiful uniforms, sparkling white, band instruments. They are shining their shoes, brightening all their equipment up. And they're going to parade in front of Congress, which was then located in Philadelphia. That was the capital of the United States. So they march through. The flags are snapping in the breeze. The drums are beating. The band is playing. It must have been an amazing sight. All the various colors of the French uniforms. It's just amazing. And then our guys came through. And here, none other than Joseph Plum Martin picks up the story. Joseph Plum Martin, again, we've talked about him. He's an excellent resource. He's an eyewitness. He wrote his diary at the time. And he talks about how the guys are like, they're just exhausted. They've got different types of uniforms. Instead of their flags being made out of silk and expensive material, they're made out of cotton. They're all shot to pieces. And they're marching through, and they just, by comparison, they look really, really bad. Joseph Plum Martin says that one of the guys that was there on Congress's side there with the congressional representatives there was none other than Robert Morris. Now, Robert Morris was the most richest man in the colonies. He was a banker. He had a whole series of banks and was really, really super wealthy. And Joseph Plum Martin said he saw Robert Morris hand a note to one of his workers, one of his assistants. And that night, some wagons rolled into the camp, and Joseph Plum Martin said that that was the first time that they'd been paid since he'd been in the Army. 5 years, no pay. Robert Morris had ordered his people to go to all the various banks and get cash, hard money, currency, report to the camp that night, and Robert Morris, ladies and gentlemen, Robert Morris paid the United States Army out of his own pocket with no idea that he was going to be reimbursed. He was the Secretary of the Treasury of the Continental Congress at the time, and he knew full well there was no money to pay him back. Barbara Tuchman, a very famous historian, says, listen, the rich have their uses. And this is an incident that she talks about. Robert Morris, out of an act of nothing but just patriotism, paid the Army out of his own pocket. At the other end of the scale, think of Joseph Plum Martin. He's been out there locking horns with the regular British Army for 5 years. He was a sergeant by this time, and had been doing that with basically no pay at all. Now, I want you guys to think about that. I want you guys to think about the phrase patriotism. We have politicians all the time that talk about how they're patriotic. If they rise to the level of Robert Morris, who was ready, willing, and able, and actually did pay the Army out of his own pocket with no thought of being reimbursed, or Joseph Plum Martin, who put his life on the line for his country for no pay, year in and year out, that's now your standard. If these idiots are out there talking about patriotism and they rise to that level, okay, well then they're patriots. Otherwise, it's hot air, ladies and gentlemen. That's all there is to it. When these people on TV start talking about patriotism, you think of Joseph Plum Martin and think of Robert Morris. Two names that you've never heard of in your life. But those are names that need to be written in American history in letters of gold. Those men did the job. All right, end of speech. Let's get back to the campaign. Our guys march out of Philadelphia. By this time, most of the men know, on the French side and on the American side, what they're up to. You know, the word has gotten out. They know what they're doing. They know where they're headed, and they know what they've got to do. And so, in order to save time, some of them are going to go by boat, and you can see them going right down the Chesapeake. But there's not enough ships to go around. So the rest of them have to hoof it. They got to do it the hard way. Again, Joseph Plum Martin talks about how men will be waiting at the bottom of a hill to help the horses by hooking onto the wagons themselves and running the wagons and the artillery, helping the horses get him up to the top of the hill. Then sprinting back down the hill, getting the next wagon, getting the next piece of artillery, and helping the horses haul that one up the hill in the flaming heat of the summer sun. And the men are running. They're like jogging to try and get down there. Ladies and gentlemen, they've got to beat the Royal Navy. If the Royal Navy gets there first, well, the game is over. Our guys won. The French and the British, they get down there. The French and the Americans, they get down there. You can see in that map in the lower right, the French take up their part of the line. The Americans take up the other side of the line, and a siege begins. Now, strong note here. Rochambeau and General Washington have written letters to the French Navy saying, listen, we need your help, we need your help, we need your help. And there had been a very touchy relationship between the French Army and the American Army and the French Navy. But this time, the French Navy came through for us. Debarras comes down there. He's got the siege guns. He lands all the way down at the very tip of the York-James Peninsula. They unloaded the siege guns, and Debarras gets out of the way because all he has is transport vessels. But de Grasse, he's gotten this message, and he's down the Caribbean, trying to protect French interests down the Caribbean. And he says, you know what? Okay, I'll leave the Caribbean on my own initiative, and I'll go up there, and I'll try and hem the British in. I'm going to do it. I'll help you guys out. And he did. The British fleet under a very famous, capable admiral, Admiral Rodney, he's going out there. He's like sailing all around. He had taken a look in the Yorktown area, didn't find anything. In other words, he sent in a scouting ship, and they'd looked around and didn't see anything. So the scouting ship goes out and tells Rodney with the main fleet, listen, there's nothing at Yorktown. They went up to New York. And Rodney, Admiral Rodney of the Royal Navy, he's like saying to Clinton, what's going on with Cornwallis? Where's he at? What's going on? And they talk and they confer, and the ships get repaired, and they start bringing on supplies. Finally, a letter shows up from Cornwallis saying, listen, I'm down here in Yorktown. You got to help me. Send help right now. Well, to make a long story short, Rodney and Clinton dallied. They played around. They hammed and hawed. They were like, well, the tide's not right, or the wind is wrong, or we've got to repair this, or we've got to repair that. Well, that gave the French time to like get, kind of show up. The siege is tightening. The guys are out there fighting. The guns have been unloaded. They're shooting and shooting and shooting. And every day, General Cornwallis is out there looking out into the bay. Man, I hope the British Navy, I hope the Royal Navy shows up. I hope they show up. He's looking every day. There had been a battle at sea. That night, way in the evening, they could see the flashes of the cannons way out at sea, and everybody knew there had been a big giant fight. Cornwallis the next day, while he's looking out there, he gets up in the morning. Oh my gosh, and it must have been an amazing sight, ladies and gentlemen. The entire bay was filled with ships. These beautiful sails billowing in the wind, these gorgeous vessels. It must have been amazing. And the wind shifted a little bit, and he could see the flags. And all the ships were French. The French Navy had defeated the Royal Navy at sea. Rodney went back to England. Went back up to New York. And the French fleet sailed into the Yorktown area. And that was the end. Cornwallis had to give up. So the story goes that everybody was looking out from the American and the French side at the firing line. And here was a British officer out there. He had a little flag, a handkerchief stuck onto his sword. There was a little drummer boy at his side beating the drum. And that was the signal for surrender, that they wanted to talk. Cornwallis said, listen, he sent through mail. They're writing these little notes back and forth. Hey, listen, give me a week to see if the Royal Navy will show up. And General Washington said, you have 1 hour to destroy all your supplies, and then you give up or we're going to assault. That's it. We're closing in on you. It's over. So Cornwallis had to give up. Back in England, when the Prime Minister, Lord North, he's already in your notes, when Lord North heard about this, he said, thank God it's over. And he meant the war. In other words, Rochambeau was right. When Cornwallis was defeated at the Battle of Yorktown, it signaled the end of the war. Parliament could not sustain the war any farther. They went to the king and said, listen, it's over with. I want to be clear. King George wanted to fight on. He kept saying, so we're going to fight on. We're going to fight on. If you guys want to see a really good movie that kind of touches upon this, it's an older movie now. But it's a very, very good movie. And it's called The Madness of King George. And it really shows King George's attitude. I think there's parts of it online as well. You want to YouTube it. But it really shows King George's attitude towards the war in America. And Nigel Hawthorne plays King George. He did an outstanding role on this. And a very good sort of image about, a snapshot of what King George was thinking about the American War of Independence. Under any circumstances, Cornwallis had to give up. So let's go to the next slide and do a little bit of image analysis. And that shows you, in other words, the consequences of the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. Now, here is a very important painting. It's made by John Trumbull, and it's called The Surrender at Yorktown. And we know a lot about, in other words, the painting itself is fairly accurate. John Trumbull's brother, Michael, is actually on the American side. He was on the American staff. And if you look kind of right behind George Washington over there on the right, you'll see three American officers looking towards, the surrender. And right immediately behind them, that fourth guy looking the other way, that is John Trumbull's brother. He was there on the American staff. So you can imagine John Trumbull, his brother, like describing exactly what was going on. So in terms of, how the surrender ceremony looked, this has got to be fairly accurate. John Trumbull was not there, but his brother was. So here we go. Now, again, this is all about image analysis. And you can see, we've talked about this before. What's the meaning of light and what's the meaning of dark? In the background, sure enough, the dark side, that's not the French who are in the foreground there underneath that white flag. That's the French. The dark is in the far background, and that's the British burning all their supplies. But it puts the British in the position of being the bad guys. It's symbolic. On the other hand, if you look kind of on the right side of the image, again, the side that has to do with, you might say, honor, you can see almost like a halo. John Trumbull has really kind of put this over the top. The American flag up there, and then George Washington surrounded by this bright yellow, this bright white, almost like a halo. He's being lionized in this picture. Okay, so let's talk about the surrender ceremony itself. Now, this did happen. So, the British surrender party, they march out there. And the guy that's going to do the surrender, he went to Rochambeau. Now, Rochambeau is on the left side of the slide. He's that officer sitting out there on the horse. That's him. And the British officer tried to surrender to Rochambeau. And in a clear voice, in plain English, so that everybody could hear it, my hand to God, this is what happened. Rochambeau said, "No, monsieur, you must surrender to the Americans." Again, Rochambeau showed his true colors. He was for the Americans. He was here to help us out. He could have taken that surrender. He could have. He was within his rights. But he said, "No, monsieur, you must surrender to the Americans." Well, the British officer, he's got his sword in his hand. He goes over there and, he talks to George Washington. I'm here to surrender. And George Washington says, "Listen, you're not General Cornwallis. Where's General Cornwallis?" The officer here is named Ferguson. And Colonel Ferguson says, "Well, Cornwallis, ladies and gentlemen, this is true. Cornwallis is not feeling well today, and he will not be making the ceremony." He's very childish. Very, very childish. Very, very petty about this whole thing. And that's important. That's going to characterize the British attitude moving forward. Well, George Washington understood about the niceties of these things. He understood about the ceremony of it. And he said, "Well, okay, you're General Cornwallis' second in command. That's fine. You surrender to my second in command." And that's going to be none other than Benjamin Lincoln. And so that's Benjamin Lincoln that you see right there in the middle on the white horse. Benjamin Lincoln had been exchanged in a prisoner exchange a few weeks earlier. In other words, our side gave up several British officers that we'd captured, and we got Benjamin Lincoln back. You could do that back in those days. Now, the story goes that Ben Lincoln took the surrender as a sort of a payback for Charleston. That's not true, really. In other words, that underrates Ben Lincoln. Ben Lincoln was a very, very highly capable, highly professional officer. And he genuinely was General Washington's very capable second in command. So Ben Lincoln took the surrender not as payback, but because he was genuinely the second in command. And he had earned that the hard way. He was a really, really good officer. So here you see the British second in command, Ferguson, handing over to the American second in command, Ben Lincoln. And so that's how the surrender went down. Again, the British are very childish about this. Joseph Plum Martin was there, and he said, "Yeah, when the British laid down their weapons, the soldiers had to lay down their weapons, and many of them would throw their weapons down in an effort to obviously break them. One soldier was seen to kiss his musket and say, 'May you never serve a better master than me.' And he threw down his rifle, his musket, in order to break it, and went on." So even the British soldiers are very, very childish about this. They're very upset. They knew that they'd fought really well, but then they'd gotten beaten by the French, who they despised, and the Americans, who they hated. But this is a really good rendition of what the surrender of the British at Yorktown, this is really a good rendition of what it looked like. And again, as a matter of symbolism, there's a lot going on here. But please don't forget, and if you take a strong note on this, which I hope you do, please make sure you write down that the British are very, very childish about this whole thing. And that will characterize the attitude of the British toward the Americans all the way until after the War of 1812, and we will talk about that later. So really quickly, let's get this tied up. We've talked about a battle. Let's talk about something else. Now, here we are. Really briefly on this slide. I'm only spend about, just a minute on this slide. I made this slide up as a sort of a win-loss. To many people in the United States today, we're all used to like win-loss categories and, football, baseball, basketball, whatever it's going to be. And so here is kind of a rough win-loss. Now, this is only a fraction of the battles fought in the American War of Independence. But it gives you a good thumbnail sketch. And so very briefly, let's go through this. Again, I make up my own slides on what I had to change my font color like 10 different times to get this right. Lexington Concord, I have it up there as a rebel victory. That's before the American Declaration of Independence, so they're still rebels. Quebec, 1775, a British victory. Bunker Hill, Breeds Hill, still a rebel victory. Then Boston, 1775, 1776, a U.S. victory. Then take a look at this. This is where I mentioned before where George Washington kept getting beat. Brooklyn Heights, Harlem Heights, White Plain, British victory, British victory, British victory. Trenton and Princeton, U.S. victory. Saratoga, U.S. victory. And as you go down through there, I want you guys to understand that there's a qualitative side to this. Quantitatively, that is to say, just by the numbers, it's just about a tie. I don't know, I think I've counted up. It's like 11 and 11 or 12 to 12, something like that. But qualitatively, understand that the British victories are always much better qualitatively. In other words, Quebec was, a huge victory over the Americans. Brooklyn Heights, Harlem Heights, White Plains, this is defeat of the regular United States Army. Washington is there and in command. So these are spectacular defeats. Same thing with Brandywine, Germantown, and Philadelphia. Washington is being defeated again and again and again. Usually he's just being plain old out-generaled. Cahokia and Vincennes and a U.S. victory, but we've talked about that. There's only a few hundred guys involved. It has consequences. More about that in a minute. But qualitatively, they're important, but quantitatively, only a few hundred guys. Kings Mountain, just 70 or 80 guys. But Camden and Gulfport Courthouse are a lot of men involved. But the only one that really counts up there is Yorktown. That's the last one. It's a U.S. and French victory. The French don't get enough credit. We could not have won the American War of Independence without them. And Yorktown's the one that counts. All right, so I spent, maybe like 3 minutes on this slide. But I just want you guys to know that what I really want you guys to get out of the slide, strong note here, and make it a big one. Change your font size, change your font color, everything. A theory about the American War of Independence goes like this. The Americans did not win the American War of Independence. The British lost it. And most of the evidence on analysis points towards that theory. A theory about the American War of Independence. The British did not, in other words, the Americans did not win it. The British lost it. The result is identical. It's just an analytical way of looking at the war. The Americans did not win the American War of Independence. The British lost it. Certainly we could not have won without the French. But the British had opportunity after opportunity. They had resources. And yet they bungled it. So with that in mind, let's go on. I think the next, we've got a couple of slides left to go, but the next one is the last one that I want to talk about with the American War of Independence, and that is the consequences of all this. Treaty of Paris, 1783. Now, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, very briefly on this. A considerable amount of time is going to pass between the time of the Battle of Yorktown, October 1781, until the Treaty of Paris, September 1783. 2 solid years are going to pass. Strong note here. Our negotiating guys are going to go to Paris, and they're going to start trying to negotiate. And you can see them up there. There's Elderbridge Gerry, Ben Franklin, once again, John Adams. Half a dozen other guys are going to be up there, and they're going to be negotiating. And our guys did a great job. Our guys did a great job. But they're trying to reach out to the British and get them to come to the negotiating tables. The British, they assigned somebody. It took them forever to do that. They're being very childish. Please write that down. The British are continuing on with this very, very negative and childish attitude toward the Americans. The French are there. We're in Paris, and they're talking about this, and the French are like ecstatic about the end of the war. Oh, my gosh, there's huge celebrations in Paris. It's crazy. Strong note here. So the question is, why did it take so long to get the treaty ending the war signed? Again, our cycle of war. A war breaks out. We fight to exhaustion, which is what happened. Then we got to sign a treaty. Here we are, the Treaty of Paris, 1783. And both sides want to start recovering their economies like right away. But we've got to end the war. Strong note now. The Americans are motivated to end the war quickly, get the treaty signed right away, because back in America, our army has to remain mobilized. We're paying all these soldiers. We have to keep them in uniform. We got to keep them all trained up. We have to keep their officers all trained up. We've got to keep them all on the scene in case we resume combat operations. Similarly, the British Army is remaining in America. They're still in New York. They're still in and around the colonies, the states. And they're going to remain there, getting supplied, being fed, resting up. And so, as it turns out, they're recovering a considerable part of their strength. So the Americans want to end the war quickly so we can get our guys back to the farm, get rid of them, knock down that cost. The British, they're ready to drag their feet. They're hoping to be able to pick off one colony at a time and have them come back to England. Now, that wasn't ever going to happen, but that's what they were thinking. So the Americans are motivated to end the war quickly, get the peace treaty signed. So with that in mind, there are three parties involved here. The British, the Americans, and the French. Strong note. The British want the opposite of what the Americans want. Whatever the Americans want, the British are going to say no. And they keep saying so. The Americans will come to the British and say, listen, what's it going to take? And the British keep saying, go ask the French. They keep saying that. And this goes on and on and on. Negotiations just dragging on. And the Americans will go to the British, go ask the French. So we go ask the French. Strong note here. If you'll recall, the French came into the war in the first place for revenge against the British for the 7 Years' War. So what do the French want? The French don't know what they want. They didn't lose any islands in the Caribbean to speak of. They don't want Canada back. They wanted revenge, and they got that. But now the French don't know what they want. So we ask the French, what do you want? And the French are like, well, monsieur, go find out what the British want. So we go to the British. What do you guys want? The British say, we want to drink our tea in peace, go away. Go ask the French what they want. The British are playing the Americans off against the French. Please write that down. This is much more complex than it appears. There's a game of diplomacy going on here. The Americans want to end the war quickly, and we do have a list of things that we want. The British want to drag this out. The French don't know what they want. Strong note now, strong note. Oh my God, this is like so sneaky. This is so slippery. Finally, the American negotiating team, they go to the British and they say, what is it going to take to get this treaty going? The British once more say, go ask the French. And our guys finally said, we don't care what the French want. And at that instant, the British said, let's sign a peace treaty right now then. Let's do it right now. Because they knew, the British knew, that if the Americans sign a separate peace treaty with Great Britain, it will drive a diplomatic wedge between the Americans and our French allies. And that's exactly what happened. Our negotiating team wants to end the war immediately for reasons of our own. We approached the British and asked them what it's going to take. They say they don't care what we want. Go ask the French. When we said we don't care what the French want, they signed immediately. Because this would drive a wedge between the Americans and our French allies. This was genius politically. It worked perfectly. Now, what did the Americans, what's the only thing they really needed? They needed to be recognized as the United States of America. What the Americans really, really needed was diplomatic recognition from Great Britain that there was a new country out there called the United States of America. And if you look at the treaty, which is those 3 documents I have up there, look at the one that's uppermost. About halfway down, it says, if you look at it carefully, it says in caps, United States of America. The seals down at the bottom are sealed by the British, and that means that the British are diplomatically recognizing the existence of the United States of America. And that's all we really needed. Now, our negotiating team did do a great job. They got all that area out there that George Rogers Clark had laid claim to. That works perfectly. And so we're going to get the Ohio River Valley. We're going to get all that. We got all sorts of other trade concessions. We got all sorts of different things that we wanted. Peace between us and Canada, basically. We're not going to attack Canada, and the Canadians are not going to do anything against us. Or the British station in Canada, they're not going to do anything else. And so our negotiating team did a good job. They did. But observe how petty the British are, which is that painting that I have up there. I put that in for a reason. This is Benjamin West. He's the artist that also painted the death of Wolfe. He was in that earlier painting in the 7 Years' War. So Benjamin West, a tremendous an artist, a portrait painter. Now, really briefly on this, ladies and gentlemen, when you paint a portrait like this, superficially you might think, okay, well, these guys all had to sit and stand, and they get all posed, and he's going to, like a snapshot, like a photograph. That's not the way it works. The artist will send around one of his assistants, and they're going to pick out some clothes that these guys have. Then he's going to set a model down and paint the clothing, put the clothing from these gentlemen, put them on one of his artists, and he's going to paint it, get a sketch going, which is what you see here. Then, in turn, each one of these guys will show up at their convenience, and again, Benjamin West will do a portrait of them. Alternatively, Benjamin West, and many artists did this, went to go see these guys and said, okay, sit down, get the light just like this, and he would draw out a sketch, get a good kind of a portrait going, a study, if you will. Then come back and put in the painting. Well, the Americans, and Ben Franklin paid for all this. This was hideously expensive. These things are expensive. The paintings themselves are enormous. Benjamin West did not work for free. And these are major works of art. But Ben Franklin was fabulously wealthy, and he paid for this. But observe that the British are missing. Again, Benjamin West, who was working in England most of the time, sent messages around, sent people around, hey, listen, why don't you set for this portrait? It's all paid for. All you got to do is sit down and take the picture. And they were like, nope, 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 nope. So this painting is unfinished to this day. And again, it's just an indication of how petty, how small-minded that the British are about this American War of Independence. They don't like the outcome at all. But again, our guys did good. Now, one last note. We did sign a separate peace treaty with the British. But we had discovered that the French were kind of working on the same thing. They needed to end the war for the same reason. Their army had to stay over there in America. It was hideously expensive to supply these guys. They wanted to bring them back to France, disband their units, get them back into barracks, do whatever it is they wanted to do with them. So they were kind of fishing around to get a separate peace treaty as well. And they will sign a peace treaty called the Treaty of Ghent. There are other treaties of Ghent. This is just the Treaty of Ghent, 1783. And that will end the war between Great Britain and France. All right? So when our guys found out that the French were like angling around for a separate peace treaty, we jumped them. We did it first. And so we got the peace treaty done. Now, one last thing, do take a look at the condition of this document. I can't overemphasize this, and it drives me crazy. This is the document that actually did give the United States our independence. That's what this document does. And look how we've treated it. It's all torn up. Somebody had the wit to put it into a 3-ring binder. A 3-ring binder? Really? That's what we did? It's all discolored? Somebody looks like they used it for a beer coaster. But this is the actual document that really does give us our independence. And so, there you have it. The war is over. The last slide is the next slide. Let's get on with it. So we've talked about the American toward the war of the Constitution of 1787. That'll be coming up next. The next slide, the next series will be toward the Constitution of 1787. We will then go on to talk about Washington's administration. We'll talk about the political parties. I'll have a lot to say on that, so be prepared to take notes on that. Looking forward, we'll talk about the Adams administration, the Jefferson administration. A little bit of a side note on this. We do not have time in this class to talk about every administration in excruciating detail. But I want to get through the first 3 on an analytical basis. In other words, Washington, his administration is sort of in the middle politically. He did not want to have political parties. Adams is kind of on what we would call the left. Jefferson is what we kind of call the right today. Moving forward, we'll talk about a Supreme Court case, Marbury versus Madison. Then we'll talk about greater westward expansion. That is to say, we're going to deal with Native Americans again. Then we'll talk about Madison and the War of 1812. For those of you looking far into the distance, our next task will be, in American history, it will be the event called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the war, the Mexican War of 1848. So in all of your readings, no matter what textbook you have, get to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. That's where we will stop and have our next test. Now, to be clear, the issues that you see here on this slide, that does not end with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. That's just the exclamation point that signals our second midterm. So, looking forward, we're going to get from the Constitution of 1787 to Madison, the War of 1812. I'll have another lead-in slide then. We'll talk about Jacksonian America. I'll talk about the Industrial Revolution. I'll talk a little bit about Indian removal. We'll talk about that. We'll have another court case as well. And then we'll start talking about the run-up to the Civil War. So thank you very much for your attention on this. If you need to go back and take a look at any of it, use your YouTube skills. Just cycle through there, find out what you need, take a look at it all. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next presentation.